trade tensions between China and the United States escalated significantly on Monday, 21, after Beijing issued a stern warning to nations considering deepened commercial ties with Washington at the expense of Chinese economic interests. In an official statement released by the Ministry of Commerce, the Chinese government made it clear that any country pursuing such a course of action would be met with swift and proportional retaliatory measures. The message underscored China's readiness to defend its strategic and economic position in the face of what it perceives as an increasingly aggressive U.S. trade agenda. This latest development signals a deepening of the already complex geopolitical rift between the two superpowers and highlights China's growing willingness to confront not only the United States directly but also third-party nations that might align themselves too closely with Washington's trade objectives. The Chinese authorities emphasized that the era of passive responses to American pressure is over, suggesting that future countermeasures could target sectors where China holds significant leverage, such as rare earth minerals, pharmaceuticals, and components crucial to global supply chains. Beijing's statement was issued in response to emerging reports from major international media outlets indicating that the U.S. government is planning to launch a renewed diplomatic and economic offensive aimed at consolidating support among its allies. According to these reports, the Biden administration, or possibly a continuation of Trump-era policies, is preparing to exert pressure on countries that are currently seeking tariff exemptions or reductions from the U.S., conditioning these benefits on the restriction of trade and technological exchanges with China. Some sources suggest that this strategy could include punitive financial measures or sanctions targeting foreign firms doing business with both countries. In response, Chinese officials accused the United States of exploiting the rhetoric of reciprocity to justify protectionist policies and unilateral demands that undermine the principles of fair competition and international cooperation. They argue that the U.S. has repeatedly imposed tariffs under the false pretense of correcting trade imbalances, while in reality using economic leverage to coerce other nations into accepting asymmetrical agreements. Beijing framed these moves as part of a broader campaign of economic containment, warning that this path could destabilize global markets and further fragment the international trading system. The sharp tone of China's statement not only reflects its growing assertiveness on the world stage, but also raises the stakes for smaller economies caught between the two giants. As Washington seeks to build a coalition to counter Beijing's influence, and China moves to protect its global economic footprint, the risk of a more polarized and conflict-driven trade environment is quickly becoming a central concern for policymakers and businesses around the world. The ongoing standoff is part of a broader and intensifying trajectory of trade conflicts that have defined U.S.-China relations in recent years. These tensions were notably amplified during the previous U.S. administration, which adopted a confrontational approach by significantly raising import tariffs and reconfiguring long-standing trade frameworks. This strategy aimed to counter what Washington viewed as structural imbalances and unfair advantages in global trade, especially with regard to China. Earlier this month, the U.S. Trade Representative disclosed that more than 50 countries had sought dialogue with Washington, hoping to secure relief or exemptions from the new wave of tariffs. These overtures reflect the far-reaching impact of U.S. trade policy shifts, which have prompted governments worldwide to re-evaluate their economic alignments and export strategies. In the aftermath, a series of bilateral negotiations have unfolded. Japan, for example, is reportedly exploring the possibility of ramping up imports of American agricultural products such as soybeans and rice, an apparent effort to demonstrate goodwill and reduce trade frictions. Likewise, Indonesia is said to be considering an increase in purchases of U.S. food and commodities, while simultaneously cutting back on imports from alternative markets. These moves signal how various countries are recalibrating their trade priorities to maintain access to the American market, even if doing so risks straining relations with China. From Beijing's perspective, the recent wave of diplomatic and commercial maneuvers led by Washington is not merely a matter of trade policy. It is interpreted as a calculated and strategic attempt to isolate China economically on the world stage. This view stems from a pattern of actions that, in the eyes of Chinese authorities, go beyond traditional protectionism and instead reflect a broader geopolitical strategy aimed at curbing China's growing influence in key global sectors. By pressuring other nations to realign their economic ties, particularly through the promise of tariff relief in exchange for limiting trade with China, The U.S. is seen as orchestrating an economic containment campaign reminiscent of Cold War dynamics, but now played out through supply chains and trade routes rather than military alliances. Beijing's forceful rhetoric, warning of resolute and reciprocal countermeasures, is designed not only to deter future cooperation with such U.S. strategies, but also to send a clear message to the international community. China will not remain passive in the face of moves it perceives as hostile. This assertiveness reflects both China's economic confidence and its growing willingness to leverage its critical role in global manufacturing and resource supply, as seen in its control over essential goods like rare minerals and pharmaceuticals, as tools of strategic deterrence. China's reaction also signals to multinational corporations and allied governments that aligning too closely with U.S. trade initiatives may come with serious economic repercussions. The standoff, however, is more than just a bilateral issue between China and the United States. As tensions escalate, other countries find themselves caught in a complex and high-stakes balancing act, forced to navigate between the two dominant economic giants. Nations dependent on trade with both powers may face pressure to choose sides or risk being penalized by one or the other, making the global trade environment increasingly unstable and fragmented. This fragmentation threatens the continuity of long-established supply chains, heightens uncertainty for investors, and complicates the policy calculations of governments and central banks alike. Ultimately, the outcome of this impasse is poised to reshape not just individual trade relationships but the very architecture of the global economy. With strategic alliances shifting and traditional economic norms being challenged, the ripple effects of this conflict are likely to be far-reaching. Markets may experience prolonged volatility, and sectors reliant on cross-border cooperation, such as technology, energy, and agriculture, could see disruptions that alter production costs, availability of key materials, and long-term planning. In this emerging landscape, both public and private actors will need to adapt quickly to a world where economic power is wielded as a primary instrument of geopolitical influence.